Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story?
My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point, his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him, and she let her guard down. This time, though, he was now 20 years old and 6 foot tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6 feet 4 inches, 225 pounds. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My BIL is an amazing guy, and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky.
What is something you will never tell Yo Clinical Psychologist here? I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole eval, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it, that he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard to buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. You are parents about.
For anyone calling bluff, this is real. I work in a work-release penitentiary. Inmates who are in the tail end of their sentences who have exhibited good behavior can apply to transfer to a work-release center that allows them to have free world jobs during the day while they're locked up at night, depending on their work schedule. Some of our 128 inmates have convictions based on violent crimes and have spent 10+ years in the penitentiary. I've been at my unit for just over 4 months now and had an inmate, gang-affiliated, not sure about his conviction. I avoid using our computer system to look up inmates' pasts. Joke with me about knowing where I live. I joked back along the lines of, "Whatever, man, you gonna come sign this roster for your tray of food or not? Makes no difference to me." He promptly responded with my address and laughed, but assured me he was playing and that he found it out for fun to mess with me. So even this guy, with no significant importance of rank or status, with everything to lose, can within weeks find my address by knowing nothing more than what my name tag says, and potentially use that information against me. I don't live alone, and he did it to joke with me.
A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts, taekwondo, if I remember correctly. Was really, really, really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks, and at one point accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere, was mostly blind, and the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face, and I felt the impact of it against the air, like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world, he would have been horrified if it had connected, because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a suddenly firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do Taekwondo with him. No, I did not.
Therapist in training and my tutor, who was a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy's back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag, and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well, because you never know who's plotting your murder.
Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot, and his wife beater had dark red-brown stains on it. The door was behind him, and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER, and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention, and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy.
First thing they told us when we did psych. I remember this one old psychiatrist whose face just didn't look right and had a weird hand. Apparently had a patient come in years ago who thought that God was telling him the psychiatrist was Satan. Took a meat cleaver to the guy and cut him up really bad. The psychiatrist couldn't get out of his office because the patient chair was between him and the desk. They ended up rearranging all the offices at the university clinics, so the psychiatrist would always be sitting closer to the door, and there was always a desk separating them from the patient.
When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man, in his 30s-ish, who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional, so I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice and friends' house, And while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls. It's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now, though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful vs if he was. He is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his "I feel terrible" were transparent and so full of shit it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to. But with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better, crazy.
I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them. I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time, I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe. Had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think. So I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily, the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them.
Had a client years ago who had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting a police officer pretty badly. The client had a volatile temper and lived in a violent family growing up. The client never got angry with me, personally. However, while talking about their family and other people in their life, the client would get so worked up with anger that I sometimes wondered if I was safe. I started pretending to be on emergency call duty in the clinic where I worked so that I had an excuse to carry a walkie-talkie with me during our sessions. Shortly after I began doing that, I terminated the therapeutic relationship and referred the client for a completely different type of treatment than what I provided. The last I heard, the new treatment method was helping the client.
Clinical psychologist in training here. I've never been afraid, but my friend had a client once who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that could break confidentiality, I will say that he had issues with masturbating too much and not doing much else. And at one point asked my friend if they could watch porn together in the next session so he could show her what he does. At another time, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching his dick through his pants a bit. Totally inappropriate behavior, obviously. This client had lots of other issues, but when these things came up, her supervisor took her off the case because it wasn't suitable for training, and my friend didn't feel safe.
Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds, and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations, but sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 a.m., and he didn't remember a second of it. Any of it. He had hallucinations before, but they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why, as it was 3 a.m., and he replied eerily calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication.
Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously fucked up people for a living. Let's just say Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing shit. She's tough as nails, and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently, this guy was either a serial rapist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile, and she fit it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims. Well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night, despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it like a hunter-prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter-of-fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Edit obviously giving tokens and letters is not only creepy, but violates the doctor-patient relationship. She would decline very firmly and clearly, and I guess maybe some stuff was intercepted before he had the chance to try and actually give it to her. It's been about 10 years since I heard the story, but it stuck with me.
I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years, I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior, but nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mum that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial.
Obligatory, not a psychologist. But I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys, and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class, at school, in front as a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid, and because he didn't give a fuck about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance, so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and done through a 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was. And one day he asked me, would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked, what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the shit out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her.